This is Amy, and you're listening to the Talkin' Appalachian podcast. Today, we're diving into a truly intriguing topic, the Melungeons. In recent years, Melungeons have increasingly stepped out of history and into Appalachia's cultural landscape. So authors like Adriana Trigiani and Barbara Kingsolver, both of whom have been interviewed on this podcast, included Melungeons in their novels. That's just an example. Barbara Kingsolver's Demon Copperhead includes a reference to Melungeons. So if you read that and you had never heard of them and you saw that in print, you might wonder, who were they? Where did they come from? And why does their story continue to inspire people to research and to write and sing and gather? If we go back in time, you quickly realize that people were not so eager to embrace Melungeon ancestry as they are now. They were called a mysterious group of people living in the Appalachian regions of the United States, particularly in Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, and North Carolina. The word Melungeon comes from the French mélange, meaning mixed. As early as the 1800s, it was used as a racial slur for about 40 families living in central Appalachia. And there are other origins of the word according to the Melungeon Heritage Association, and I'm probably going to mispronounce these, so just bear with me. One origin is the Afro-Portuguese term melungo, supposedly meaning shipmate. Yet another is the Greek term melon, meaning black, and other researchers have speculated that Melungeon derives from the Turkish Melungeon, meaning cursed soul, the Italian Melungeona, eggplant, referring to one with dark skin, or the Old English term Melungeon, which means guile or deceit. So Melungeons were often described as having darker skin tones than their European-descended neighbors. Many had curly hair, dark eyes, and facial features that seemed to blend European, African, and Native American traits. And that led to a lot of speculation about their ancestry, with some people believing they were the descendants of escaped slaves or that they were mixed with indigenous groups. But as we'll see, their genetic makeup was far more complicated than anybody initially realized. When I first began teaching at UVA's College at Wise, the late Dr. Brent Kennedy was researching and writing about his own Melungeon ancestry. He wrote the book, The Melungeons, A Resurrection of a Proud People. And we worked there together, so I sought him out one day and sat down with him in his office to talk about his research. He said, like so many of us, he'd been told he was Scotch-Irish. But that didn't seem to align with what he was seeing in family photos. And for a while, it didn't really matter, but then he started to get sick. He suffered from aching joints, swollen legs, and he had trouble breathing. He was diagnosed with sarcoidosis and familial Mediterranean fever, which are more common in the Mediterranean and Middle East, and the National Institute of Health confirmed that diagnosis later. At that time, Kennedy had found 13 other people in the area with that diagnosis, and there were physical characteristics that also seemed to form a pattern, such as reddish or olive skin tone. That set him on a path to find out more about his family. And he did what so many of us do. He questioned family members. He got into genealogical research. He sifted through old photos. He read about abandoned Spanish and Portuguese soldiers in southern Appalachia. He read about Sir Francis Drake, who left 1,500 Turkish captives on Roanoke Island in the late 16th century. He questioned whether it was possible that their descendants could have interbred with whites, blacks, and Native Americans, but the research didn't sit well with some academics. Kennedy told the Associated Press that it was as if they considered Appalachian history a done deal with no need for revision. But then DNA evidence came along. Dr. Kevin Jones, another colleague of mine at UVA-Wise at the time, began analyzing DNA from hair and cheek cells of 120 Melungeon men and women. And at that time, his findings suggested that they were genealogically distinct, with Northern Indian or Middle Eastern DNA and genetically similar. And these findings seemed to support Kennedy's theory. Keep in mind, however, this is 20 years ago, and there's been so much advancement in DNA analysis since then. In 2021, a study in the Journal of Genetic Genealogy reported that genetic evidence in DNA now shows that the families historically called Melungeons may be the offspring of sub-Saharan African men and white women of Northern or Central European origin. According to Travis Lawler of the Associated Press, Estes and her fellow researchers theorize that the various Melungeon lines may have sprung up from the unions of black and white indentured servants living in Virginia in the mid-1600s before slavery. They conclude that as laws were put in place to penalize the mixing of races, the various family groups could only intermarry with each other. So if you claimed to be Spanish or Cuban or Italian, for example, you wouldn't face the same discrimination, even the possibility of death, that you would if you were accused of being black. There were records of people going to court over their inheritances for this reason. To be black was to lose your inheritance. But that didn't apply if darker skin could be explained with another ethnicity. And here are two examples from historical documents. One is from author Ann Toplovich, who wrote that the earliest historical record of the term Melungeon dates to 1813. In the minutes of the Stony Creek Baptist Church in nearby Scott County, Virginia, which is near me, a woman stated that another parishioner made the accusation that, quote, she harbored them Melungeons. In December 1943, Walter Plecker of Virginia issued a letter to local authorities, alerting them to, quote, colored families attempting to present themselves as white or Indian, in defiance of the 1924 Racial Integrity Act. Dr. Brian McKnight is my colleague at UVA's College at Wise. He's in the Department of History and Philosophy, and he's founding director of the Center for Appalachian Studies. He's also an author of several books. He's currently researching Walter Plecker, and I asked him to tell me more about Plecker's role in all of this.
Walter Ashby Plecker was the Virginia director of the State Bureau of Vital Statistics. We know that that's the office in Virginia where you write if you lose your birth certificate and they'll send you a new copy. Historically, that job has been to record birth certificates and make sure those birth certificates go on record as being accurate, etc. Plecker took it a step further. Plecker was a physician. He was from Augusta County, apparently a pretty good doctor in his day. But Plecker was a racist, and he was a scientific racist. He was into phrenology and the measuring of skulls to make sure people were properly intelligent and to show these to give some, I suppose, evidence to suspicions of racial inferiority. In 1924, Virginia passed what becomes known as the Racial Integrity Law. Now, this updates a 1910 law that had been passed in Virginia. The 1910 law says that you are classified as black if you are 1/16 black. The 1924 law is a one-drop law. If there is one drop of black blood in your past, you are black, which is kind of interesting to a historian because we look at the 19th century, particularly the era of slavery, as being the great age of full-throated racism. But in 1924, Virginia and a lot of southern states were passing these one-drop laws, which really superseded anything that had preceded them officially. Now, one of the byproducts of this is that anyone who has any non-white ancestry is now classified as non-white. One of the more entertaining aspects of this is Pocahontas, who married John Rolfe way back in the 16 teens. Her descendants grew into these very influential figures in Virginia history and very politically and economically powerful figures in Virginia history. As of 1924, they were black. They were not afforded any of the benefits of citizenship, etc., in Virginia. So This becomes a real lightning rod, particularly for those descendants of Pocahontas. And within a year or two, the state legislature is going to write in the Pocahontas exception, which basically means anybody with a drop of non-white blood is non-white. Unless you descended from Pocahontas, then you're purely white, which is pretty laughable from my perspective. But, we all have to do what we have to do to justify what we do. One of the more interesting things about this is Plecker. He sticks around in this job for a very long time. And in 1943, he is hearing rumors that black people are moving out of their home counties, moving to new counties, getting married to white people, and having children who will then pass as white for the rest of their lives. Well, of course, somebody like Plecker, they're going to be opposed to this. So what Plecker does is he writes a letter to all the registrars across the state of Virginia, and he explains his rationale. And he goes as far as including a list of counties and surnames from those counties that should be, at this point forward, classified as black. Interestingly enough, throughout Virginia, you have these very common names that would automatically become black as a result of this letter. In Southwest Virginia, it's among the most popular names in the region. But ultimately, this letter doesn't actually go that far. I'm not sure that any of the registrars actually changed any of the classifications, and ultimately the Racial Integrity Act is going to go by the wayside.
This is incredible to look back in history and see that this man, as late as 1943, was able to do this as an official of Virginia. So for some families, this resulted in the loss of official documentation that had affirmed their ongoing self-identification as Native American on government forms.